without further ado, actually, they've got nice, straightforward names, but I thought it'd be so much easier to get them to tell us their names and a little bit about the papers that they will be presenting for us this afternoon. So if I'll get Chrissie to go first, and then I'll then follow up with Matt, and then over to David. Okay.
I'm Chrissie Chevasutt, and I am employed by St Columba's United Reformed Church in Oxford as a community worker, and I'm their outreach and development worker with transgender, intersex and non-binary people.
And you're going to be presenting for us this afternoon, revolting sort of Christians. You're looking at Dominionism or foot washing, a time to choose. Yeah, excellent. Brilliant.
Matt Plen. I'm a little bit hoarse following a cold, so hopefully my voice will won't completely crack. Matt Plen. I was until recently the chief executive of Masorti Judaism. Masorti movement is one of the denominations of Judaism in this country and in the world, affiliated with conservative Judaism in North America, and we're I suppose the quickest way of describing it is we're a centrist denomination of Judaism, kind of part somewhere between Orthodoxy and Reform, I guess, would be the quick way of saying it. I finished my role in Masorti Judaism earlier this year, and I'm still involved in the community, but really want on professional challenges, and I'll be talking about what was the title I gave it?
Faith-driven social action, lessons from Jewish education.
There you go. And and that's I can't remember the title, but it does come from my PhD thesis, which is also a book which is about Judaism, education, and social justice. The subtitle of which, for anyone who's interested, is Towards Jewish Critical Pedagogy, which for anyone who's involved in those issues will also mean something, and we can talk about that in due course.
Excellent. And over to David.
Hello, I'm David Coleman, special category United Reformed Church minister, working as environmental chaplain with Eco Congregation Scotland, which means I cover geographically the whole thing from Shetland to the borders, working with any sort of church that shows an interest in care for creation.
And David, interestingly, your paper is entitled Kill the Steward.
Yep.
Shall we read the rest?
Kill the steward, be more church, and pray for heaven too. Yes.
Yes, and it's a personal sort of view, looking at as a time as the eco chaplain. So, as the last person to speak for us there, I'll let you start, David, with giving us your 5 to 7 minute presentation of your paper.
Okay, here we go. So what I'm going to do is share some slides like that. Okay. So, I mean, I suppose I should say, again, this is just summarizing the main paper, that I hate footnotes. And I do get fed up with the culture where when somebody has what really should be a public domain inspiration, that gets undermined by bowing and scraping to venerable authorities who, in many cases, have no idea of today's global context. So what I'm suggesting is that we need to not just to have revolted, but to be a little bit more Trotskyite and keep on revolting. And in saying that, again, late 20th century creation theology, I keep seeing this book referred to in many people's papers. That got me into trouble at college, but it cannot address current events. And the objectifications of creation, which are implied by the continued use of this stewardship Christianity, which maintains, which is like looking after property rather than engaging in a partnership with fellow creatures. It also it encourages a sort of anthropocentrism, which was the convinced boast of educated people well into my adulthood. All this does sometimes worse than nothing, because in speaking like that, no other creature is conceded the dignity of personhood, or indeed a soul, whatever we mean by that. We really need to make it clear to everyone, that, including ourselves, that things have moved on. We cannot unsee even what's happened in the last few weeks. Since I wrote the paper, I've accepted also the need to follow the lead of industry and talk of a climate and nature, or nature and climate crisis, rather than that shorthand of climate. God save us from destination rather than direction. In our time, churches are still being willfully misled by talk of fixing the crises. Though by the standards we previously held, we are also into an age of too late. And I think we need to realize that that's what we are given Easter for. Things like Easter should be there as a resource for noting that we are too late. Overall, then, our scriptures and traditions are neither single use nor disposable. Prophecy doesn't have to have been fulfilled once and for all. That's the value. So don't waste your time with net zero in weekday meetings unless you are preaching it on Sundays. And you should be able to. I'm also irritated and revolting against what I'd see as a self-destructive demon abroad in post-war UK, always slagging off what they call religion. And in the UK context, that comes over as people hearing, let's forget all this Christianity crap. Religion is what makes available to people who are not outside for people who are not part of the elites, makes available the resources of spiritual resilience, which we're going to need for the rest of our lives. So recycle and repurpose, and don't throw away all the constitutive stories that we will take to our deathbeds. This is a self-harm which needs revolting against. In short, be more church. Take seriously what we're meant to be about. Is that so terrifying? And be attentive to things that you have dismissed and ignored and read past, things that you think you're so familiar with that you no longer need Moses' sort of double take with that bush. And by the way, again, describing the burning bush, it's blazing. It's not fireproof. It's in the uttermost distress. And learn to heed those warnings and blatant ultimatums that you find the Gospels are stuffed with. Everything also of which it's been said to you, and this is a direct quote from Pastoral Practice, that might be Christian, but we couldn't possibly do that. Urgency means I have to live as a complicit prophet. I am a person of unclean lips amongst a people of unclean lips, as Isaiah said, with no time left to get completely green before I'm encouraging others to shift. But churches need permission to shift. That's why Eco Church and Eco Congregation Scotland and other permission-giving movements deserve the most active support from church leadership. When you're in Glasgow, you might come across the Poverty Truth Commission, and they picked up, again, they stole it from somewhere else, they couldn't care less where, this phrase, nothing about us without us is for us. Nothing about us without us is for us. We hear that from communities who are now suffering loss and damage, and from the wildlife that they are not embarrassed to be related to. Nothing about us without us is for us. So don't waste time with any eco-theology which can't get over that we hump, that in the practice of our faith we look creation in the eye, because you can't love God without loving your siblings of whatever species. So we need not a new ivory tower eco-theology pondering creation as a theologian's construct, but a baptism of general practice Christianity into the eyes wide open liberation of truth about where we are. The truth offered pastorally and therefore openly in love. You've got to be able to say the tough stuff, the truth, on Sundays to the people. Don't also be afraid of being mainstream, but don't sell your soul to get there. Do you have to dilute the truth, or do you hold it back because of this worry about telling it in love? Not in emergency, you don't. Now, you see, there is now no longer pastoral without prophetic. Jesus is incarnate into and ascended into a unified creation of heaven and earth, soil and sky, authenticating our faith with terrestrial, visceral experience. So when Jesus taught the disciples to pray, was this to include prayer for the climate as well as the soil? Or was it the wild wind is saying to the churches, don't take it for granted that all is well in the heavens in the Lord's Prayer. Your will be done in soil and sky both. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. Okay. Chrissie, I'm going to ask you to follow on from David, if that's okay. Yeah?
Dominionism or foot washing. Genesis starts with the command to humanity to have dominion over the earth, to rule and subdue. My paper is really a very personal story of embodied theology, of realizing and discovering within my own human existence that where I am today, we've been talking about Kairos moments, everything has come to a head. I knew I was trans since I was little, or I knew I was different. And because I was shamed by society, by Christianity, I buried that. Lived a life of torment. The experience that I spoke about with my grandfather, I've only come to understand in recent years that what I witnessed, what I was experiencing was a man who was at the end of the agrarian age, one of the very last generation who would learn everything they knew orally. And I realized that the Industrial Revolution wiped his world out, wiped his knowledge out, and that knowledge began to be passed through academia and not through the lived experience of those close to the earth. Simultaneously, I was seeing on the news the schools in Canada, the discovery of hundreds and hundreds of child graves, unnamed children of Indigenous tribes who had been put through the program of assimilation. Growing up, I lived in torment. I heard the blues at the age of 9, 10, and 11, and my hair stood on end. I had goosebumps, and I connected viscerally with the songs that I was hearing because they were songs of lament, and they expressed my soul in a way that Christianity, the gospel, and the good news never could, because my lived experience was one of oppression and torment. I ran away from home, fell off the rails, and I ended up in London at exactly the same time as Rastafari hit town. And I heard the song, the Bob Marley song, redemption songs. All I ever hear is redemption songs. And it resonated because I had witnessed Christianity as the oppressor. And as I imbibed and absorbed Rastafari and began to understand Black consciousness, the Babylon system was capitalism and Christianity, and I didn't have any other perspective. I fell off the rails even further and came to faith and came to know Jesus. Rastafari opened me up spiritually into a journey of faith. Jesus fulfilled that journey. And I chose to follow Jesus for the rest of my life as the way, the truth, and the life. From the moment I entered church, I entered an alien world that I didn't understand, it didn't understand me, and that was oppressive to me as a queer person. So I never from the beginning wanted to earn the label Christian or Christianity because I felt it was a religion of oppression as a queer person. Although I wasn't out as a queer person, I knew who I was, and I knew that I wouldn't and couldn't survive in the church because the moment I came out, I would be put out the door. So that was 80s, 90s, 2000s. I came out to myself 2013, 2014. Coming out in the context of Christianity and the church, I have experienced firsthand the oppression, the rejection, the silencing. And I believed when I came into the church that the church and Christianity was part of the Babylon system. I've existed within the Christian church for 42 years now, and I would consider myself a survivor of Christianity. My thesis is that Christianity, Dominionism, is the belief that we should go out and convert everybody before we've ever listened to them, before we've ever heard them, before we've ever understood their faith, their beliefs, their religion, their culture. And what Dominion has done, Christendom has done, has erased indigenous people, their knowledge, their connection to the earth, their language, their ways, the knowledge that you cannot pass on through academia, but you pass on through your lived experience. So when I talk of the farmer, my grandfather's story, the farmer who had never been educated could feel the earth through his boots and would know instinctively the time to sow, to harvest, to plough. You cannot pass that on through academia. Christendom has erased indigenous peoples all around the world, has erased that knowledge, and that is why we are facing this ecological disaster. So the metanoia that we need to go through, being complicit in that, and I include myself within that because I've worked in missions, and I still feel it within church, that we feel compelled and called to convert everybody. I have to question that. The call to convert someone before we have washed their feet, before we have felt their wounds and their pain, before we have understood the knowledge that they embody, the desire to convert them to our faith, to our religion, is what has caused the disaster we're in. So what I'm calling into question is that conversion beliefs, conversion theology is an expression of dominionism. Now you can be conservative, capital C, and you can be conservative, small c. You can also be dominionist, capital D. So if we go to the US, to America, we see dominionism, and the belief in dominionism is to rule in government, to rule in every area and institution that we can, to take control, to rule. So dominionism is actually a movement within Christianity, but we can all be dominionist, small d, in our beliefs. And I think we denigrate those that we are seeking to convert because we're not loving them. We have an agenda to place upon them. I am not saying in all of that we shouldn't be making disciples of Jesus Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. So I kind of challenged David's presentation about religion. It's very easy for priests and pastors to defend religion because it pays their salaries. Experiencing the oppression of Christendom firsthand, I live and work in Oxford University. When I started my role last year, in the first 3 months, in a 6-week period, I experienced 3 young trans suicides. 3 young trans suicides close to home in a 6-week period. Do I rage? Yes, I do. Because Christendom has been one of the biggest institutions to oppress queer peoples. So, and it's not just white straight supremacy. Black people are also guilty of straight supremacy. And I can call it by no other name. It is institutional and structural violence against queer people. So the depths that we need to go to become foot washers who go out into the world, not to take dominion, not to rule, not to enforce conversion, but to love and listen to those that we have oppressed, the poor of the South. And I do have a solution that I would propose to the URC especially, but that's for later.
Chrissie, thank you. Thank you so much. There's nothing like a lived experience really to begin to get us at the heart of the matter. So thank you. And I look forward to hearing the solution. I've read it, it's in here. I look forward to hearing that a little bit later. So Matt, it's over to you.
Thank you.
Am I allowed to say anything before you start?
Please.
Like, I shared a table at lunch with Matt, and he's quite challenging.
That was my table manners, though. That's not.
Oh, is it?
That was the spray food and so on.
Welcome.
Thank you. So it's wonderful to be here. Thank you. It's always a real privilege and a challenge to step into a different faith space. I'm Jewish, and that's the sphere I usually operate in. But I always enjoy interfaith dialogue, and especially with Christian colleagues actually. So thank you for inviting me in, and hopefully there'll be some fruitful discussion that will come out of this. And I'll say a word or two at the end of the next 5 to 7 minutes about some of the difference. It's very hard to generalise, but maybe some points of difference that I can sort of identify between Jewish and Christian. And just to say that it's obviously going to be an overgeneralisation. There's some points of difference between some Jewish and some Christian approaches to, I think, issues of social justice, and maybe I'll touch on that at the end, and maybe that will be fruitful as well. So I enjoyed reading both papers, Chrissie's and David's papers, and I read them a bit too fast, and then I had to go back and read them again. So I've actually read them twice in the end, and it seems to me that they demonstrate, both papers demonstrate in different ways the fact or the idea that there's a connection between the theological or, I'm going to wrap theology and politics up actually. So a theological or political stance, or I guess you could theological, political, or whatever you might want to call that, stance on the one hand, and an educational or pedagogical stance on the other. And so for example, in your paper, Chrissie, I noticed the connection between the theology of foot washing and your description of that sort of traditional organic knowledge that you talked about your grandfather having or the indigenous peoples have. And it seems to me, you didn't sort of flesh this out, but it seems to me there's a connection between those two things. And I think in what you just said now, fleshed it out a little bit more actually. And in David's paper, I'm not sure what the words would be exactly that I'd use, but it seemed to me that there's a sort of connection between the theology of crisis, a sort of very radical theology of crisis on the one hand, and I say this with appreciation, by the way. It sounds a bit flippant what I'm about to say, but it almost sounds like a pedagogy of shouting. As kind of, and I mean that in a positive sense. We've just got to shout, and we've got to bring people's attention and alert them. And I think there's a connection between those two things. I mean, you can hear the connection between the crisis and the response to that, but at the same time as well. So my question is, the question that I started off from is what kinds of, to be a little bit more explicit about the question, and my question is, what kinds of pedagogy or education can help us realise radical political or theological positions? Right? In other words, what do we do educationally? What should we be doing educationally? And I mean educationally broadly. It can apply to preaching, it can apply to work with students in schools, it can apply to higher education, it can apply to youth work, it can apply to parenting. So I mean in the broadest possible sense. But what should we be doing educationally in order to realise the kinds of theology and politics that we want to realise? I leave the question broad in that way on purpose. And the answer to a set of answers to that question, I think, can be derived from Jewish tradition and Jewish practice. I guess one sort of note before I get to the kind of point I want to make is that it seems to me, we've heard it in the two presentations already, is that every tradition has oppressive elements in it, and as well as emancipatory elements. And we heard that very clearly, I think, for both of the papers that we just listen to. And that's equally true of Judaism. I mean, if we only have to think about the Hebrew Bible, or, you know, if I think about rabbinic literature, or I think about contemporary Jewish thought, there are things in there which are really progressive and emancipatory, and there are things in there which are racist and oppressive and so on. And I think we all have to look back now in the faith. We have to look at our own traditions in the face and realise that. What that means, though, is that there's a lot of interpretive work to be done. In other words, I think the idea that all we need to do is apply our traditions to reality and get a progressive result is not helpful, because you can apply our traditions to reality and get terrible results, as we see all around us, and we just heard about. And I think about contemporary Israel, for example, and I lived in Israel for a long time. I have Israeli citizenship. That's, I feel, a very close connection. But when I think about contemporary right-wing religious Israeli politics, it makes my hair stand on end. And that's a direct application of, they're not distorting Judaism, they're just applying it in a certain way. And the results can be terrible. And we can see similar things with Christianity, with Islam, with Hinduism and other parts of the world as well, I think. So the three things I'm just going to draw attention to, which I mentioned in the paper, I think are antidotes to that as well. And the three pedagogical principles which I draw from this article by an educationist called Lee Shulman are these things which the Hebrew terms of Devar Torah, Chevruta, and Machloket. And I'll just say a sentence or two about each of those things. So Devar Torah literally means a word of Torah. And by Torah, generally we mean the entirety of Jewish tradition. It's not only restricted to the 5 books of Moses. And often we'll call a sermon in synagogue a Devar Torah, a word of Torah. In Yiddish they would call it a Wort, actually a word. That's the word that's the word they would use for it. But the idea of Devar Torah is that we're creating a dialogue between reality and Torah. So we're looking at reality. And I did a workshop on this actually with people on Sing the other day about how to write a sermon, for lay people. And I said the first rule is keep it to under 5 minutes, then nothing else can go wrong. That was the first tip. But aside from that, I said this is Devar Torah. So what you need to do is think carefully, first of all, about what are the issues you care about that are going on in your life or in the world around you. They can be moral, they can be political, they can be personal, they can be family, whatever you like. Put that to one side. Now go and look at the Torah portion and see what's going on in there, and then create a circle between those two things and find the points of contact. How does your reality enable you to interpret the Torah, and how does the Torah enable you to interpret reality? And out of that, all kinds of insights will emerge. So that's Devar Torah. And that's the first foundation, I think, of a progressive faith-based pedagogy. The second one is this thing called Chevruta. And Chevruta is an Aramaic word that comes from the Hebrew roots for friend, chaver. And it means, it means friend. The best translation might be friendship, companionship, but it's used to describe a particular mode of pair study, which if you go to a traditional yeshiva or a Jewish house of learning, you'll see people study. It's not quite like a Western library. There'll be a barrage of noise because everyone's sitting in pairs studying the text out loud. And that's traditionally how people study Jewish texts. You may have seen this or experienced it. But for me, the most important thing about Chevruta is while you're studying the text, you're in a relationship with the text, but just as importantly, or more importantly, I would say, you're actually in a relationship with each other. So by studying and by learning, we're building relationships and we're building community, and we're building community which is based on a one-to-one relationship, which has obviously theological implications that we don't necessarily need to go into. But if we think about ideas like human beings being created in the image of God, then that, who do we see when we look at the person we're studying with? So there's something very fundamental there about understanding that the learning is all about relationship building and it's all about community. And that's the second principle. The third principle is called Machloket. And Machloket comes from the Hebrew root meaning to take something apart or parts of a thing. Chelek. A chelek is a part. And Machloket is used in the Talmud primarily to describe debate, unresolved debates and controversies. So if anyone's ever studied Talmud or other rabbinic literature, you'll know that usually it will discuss an issue, present lots of different opinions, tease out the arguments between them, and then leave the question usually unresolved. And it preserves all the minority opinions on the page. You can see that we might know that Jewish law eventually says you have to do X, right? There will be an answer at some point, but all of the minority opinions and the rejected solutions are also preserved on the page, so we can see what they were, and we know who said them, right? So that's what Machloket is about. And it seems to me that machloket is a vital foundation for any kind of radical or progressive pedagogy, because it lends itself, first of all, and one of my rabbis, Rabbi Chaim Wiener, said, for him, machloket is powerful because it reminds him that he might always be wrong, right? However right he thinks he is, he always has to know that he's probably, there's a 50% chance he's wrong, and only by listening to the voice of the other do you actually get to the right solution in the end. So there's a pragmatic, practical reason to have a machloket, which is it enables us to get to proper solutions. And if you imagine applying that to contemporary political discourse, how much it would improve things, right? In terms of just policy formulation, if we actually listen to the voice of others. But I think that's the second reason why machloket is important, which is that it's at root of a fundamentally radically democratic idea, because the idea is one of pluralism, right? That there's more than one answer, there's more than one truth, there's more than one way of looking at the world, and only by exposing ourselves to that, first of all, we get to better answers. But even before the answer, recognizing that everyone is different and all the different views are valid, and actually there are people whose voices aren't heard, and those are the voices that we need to resurface. That's it seems to me the foundation of a genuinely democratic pedagogy, and for me, democracy is absolutely core to social justice. So I'll finish off by saying one more thing, which is that, and by the way, in the paper that I wrote, you can see there are lots of examples, and I gave sort of case studies and so on about how people pursue these things. But the final thing I would share is that it seems to me that I was just thinking on the train actually on the way up here about the relationship between Christian and Jewish radicalism. If we think about sort of a Christian progressive or radical politics compared to a Jewish progressive or radical politics, and I know more about Catholic, I know more about Catholic liberation theology and Catholic social teaching than I do about Protestant tradition, so I'll sort of come out and say that, and I know less about that than I know about Judaism. So so you can tell me all about Protestant approaches in a minute. I know less about. But it seems to me that Judaism puts a real, and this is for very good historical reasons, Judaism puts a real emphasis on critique and nuance and reformism, actually, and caution when it comes to social justice and on democracy, and in certain ways on democracy and diversity and pluralism, and on inclusion. So when you look at people writing now in the Jewish world about social justice, they're writing from a specifically Jewish perspective. Often they're quite modest, I would say, in the way that they write, in that they don't talk, David's tone from before, which I really appreciated hearing, felt very un-Jewish in the sense that it was again, in a very positive way, very strident and very unambiguous and very determined. And I think much Jewish thought around social and environmental justice won't be any less committed, but it'll be much more kind of hedged around and thinking through different points of view and thinking, how can we advance this in a careful, cautious way, which brings all of the voices to bear? And I think that's probably a hallmark of Jewish approaches. I'll say one more sentence, which is that it seems to me, the final thing I'll say is that it seems to me that actually an approach which puts the emphasis on really connecting in a sophisticated way between scripture and the world, and which is all about relationship building, and which is all about pluralism and difference, the results might be more cautious, but it seems to me that actually the approach is no less radical and might be just as radical in a different way for preserving those foundations. And so when, for example, thinking about the climate crisis, there's obviously a moment when dealing with, and the word crisis says it all, right? But there's obviously a moment where what's required now is action. But when it comes to engaging, for example, young people or our congregants with issues of environmental or social justice, my question is, how do we actually engage them, and how do we actually get them to think, and how do we really get them involved in the issues in a deep way without simply trying to impose our views on them? The danger in imposing our views is that becomes anti-democratic and potentially oppressive. And my question is, how do we bring these values out from the dialogue rather than just trying to push them forward? So that's the challenge that I'll finish with.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our speakers, and that's quite a challenge you've left us there with, and it's fascinating because part of our discussion over the last sort of few hours and stuff haven't really touched on engaging young people in quite the way that you've picked that up, Matt. So I'm really grateful for that. David, can I come back to you? I'm sorry, I'm supposed to be on the camera. I do apologize. Sorry. All right. Okay. All right. Okay.
I can see you. Yes.
Oh, good. That's okay. One of the things, actually, David, that I found really quite interesting, and you didn't quite pick up in your presentation for me, is that whenever I write anything and I refer to people and their color, and if I'm referring to someone who's Black, I tend to put it in uppercase B. And one of the things you were suggesting in your paper was writing the word earth with an uppercase E. And I wondered, just thinking that through, whether or not you feel that will make much of a difference if we begin to see earth in that sort of level of importance.
Right. That's a little game I suggested. Certainly you might remember to the Ministers' Conference of the URC. And I don't know whether it makes much distance, but it's part of playing the game of finally getting human beings to relate to fellow creatures, to take seriously the voice and the personalities of creation, which have been semantically and otherwise systematically marginalized and excluded from our reception of Scripture, our way of praying, the whole way we do church. And it seems a tiny little leap to go to actually say they who for the earth rather than it, but you'd be surprised at the level of resistance you come across.
All right, thank you. Okay, you had a little bit of a challenge, I think, from Chrissie, who had expressed, no, not at all, expressed quite openly that she shared a very different view to
I'm not sure she did, but okay. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Let's see, carry on.
Okay, so there was the strength of church and the whole sense where the dominion aspect took over, and for her it was actually quite oppressive. And I just wanted to see whether or not you wanted to pick that up, because yeah.
So the problem there is I can say the word religion and mean one thing, and you can say the word religion and mean a totally different thing. So we can clash in our understanding, even using the same words. So I see Christianity as the tradition, the religion, the institution, the industry that it is, employing millions of people, making billions of pounds every year. I see that as religion. I have struggled all my life in the church to understand in many ways what much of the tradition, the religion, the industry, the infrastructure, the subculture has to do with Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, because I've honestly not experienced the connect. So that was my challenge, I suppose, because I am totally committed to the way, the truth and life.
Yep. I felt when you said that, I actually, I would not defend anything you've attacked or disagreed with, especially things like the destruction of things like you described with your grandfather, that relationship with the earth, which should be seen to be there, not only in Scripture, but also in tradition, certainly before the Enlightenment and going back, the relationship which is so redeeming and healing. Though also I've come across people who really are middle-class elites who slag off religion, and then I went back to my little church in Greenock where there was a widow, well, not quite a widow because she was living with a husband with dementia who spent all day telling her how awful she was. And she got an hour of paradise, almost whatever you said, put it that way, when she came to be part of the church. The church enables people in the grassroots to do things when it works properly, and all your very useful reservations should be helpful in getting it to work properly.
I wonder if I could just,
yes, sure.
I wonder if there's a question about what we mean by more. So the phrase "more church" is, or more.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I wonder what, I mean, more of what, right? So more of, I mean, I think, my wife, for example, grew up in an Orthodox Jewish home, quite a strictly Orthodox Jewish home. She rebelled against it in the end. Partly she felt as a woman it was oppressive, but also she felt, and it was a reasonably liberal kind of home. It wasn't, there was no sort of nightmare scenario from that point of view, but she still found it quite oppressive. But she found it oppressive in general because Judaism is actually all about regulating the details of how you behave in life. And she just couldn't, it didn't suit her personality type, and she rebelled against it. She didn't want to be told what to do every minute of the day by a holy text of any kind. And so the question, whereas my children, if you ask my children what Judaism is like, for them, they're very immersed in Jewish life. But for them, it's all freedom of choice. They get to choose what they do. And so more Judaism, if I take the phrase, but more Judaism for my children means something very different than more Judaism for my wife. And maybe we need to think, if there's a qualitative question about what is this thing we want more of, I only wonder whether that more church or that more Judaism or that more religion slogan is a little bit...
Right, I can give you a context for it.
On the side and sort of say, what is the thing we want more, rather than insisting on the more. Sorry, Dave, go ahead.
The context there is when churches, denominationally or at a local level, decide they're going to do something environmental. And then they forget their churches. They forget that it's a response of faith. They forget that it's out of love for the earth and for their neighbor, and they just pretend all that spiritual stuff doesn't make any difference, when actually it's the only thing that really does shift people at all. Facts and figures, as we're very well aware, do nothing of the sort. We've got them coming out of our ears. Also, again, the community, the spiritual treasures of tradition, which you're recycling, getting out of the box, as Jesus put it, are a resource for us. And some of the wilder ones, the ones that in college I was told to leave alone, are really just what we need right now, because we've got that spiritual solidarity with a tradition through them. So more of the stuff you need, but you need the freedom to discern what you don't need.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, David. And just before I turn to the chat behind me, sort of, which I can't see or read at this point, is there any hope for the steward?
No.
Oh.
I can give you the historical background to it, but really it's a wishy-washy way of not dealing with dominionism.
On that very note, thank you. Right, Chrissie, do you want to pick up your proposal as to what could we do, perhaps, to...
Yeah, so my experience is that tradition dictates the church rather than the words of Jesus dictating the church, and the practice and the models of Jesus dictating the behaviours of the church. So conversion, I believe, Jesus left to the Holy Spirit. He asked Peter, "Who am I?" We have dominion on the one side, which is the arrogance that we believe we've got to convert everybody before we've even heard them, before we've even listened to them, before we've even understood them, and the beauty and the gifts that they bring because they're made in God's image. We have a choice between dominionism and foot washing. When Jesus was washing their feet, he was actually saying goodbye. He was also, if you understand Jewish tradition, connecting with them and saying, how was your journey? Journeys can be a very arduous thing. Travel, it comes from the word travail. Travail means hardship, it means suffering, it means struggle. So when he was washing their feet, he was saying to them, how has your life journey been? I'm going to be leaving you physically now, but I'm checking in with you. I want to know that you're okay today. He's washing their feet. He's listening. He's discerning, he's empathizing, he's feeling. More than that, he's touching, he's being tender, he's being loving, he's being kind, he's being tactile. With dominionism, we don't stop to listen. So that's my proposal, I suppose. If we translate that into how we express our faith today as a denomination, as a people, as an individual, the beauty I see of Jesus is that even Jesus creates the platform for the oppressed to be heard. He takes the woman caught in adultery and gives her a platform. And what does she do? She washes his feet, or she washes, we don't know which character exactly, but the immoral woman who broke the jar, I think it is, the woman who washed. They are now recorded forever in history because he gave them that platform. Someone who was oppressed, someone who was despised, someone who was marginalised and oppressed, who religion was thrown away and discarded. He creates the platform for. So for me, the URC, we are money rich. We're going to be selling off buildings when we can, there's huge wealth at our disposal. What are we using that wealth for? We should be using that wealth to give a voice to the people from the south, to give a voice to the poor, to give a voice to those who are suffering pollution. We should be platforming them. We should be sending teams out, missionary teams, not to convert them, to listen to them, to record them, to document the evidence, to bring it back, and to be the prophetic church that we should be, and broadcast to the nations what we're finding. We should be going to the tin mines where the rivers are polluted. We should be filming those people's stories. We should be paying for them to fly to the UK, and we should be giving them our platforms if we want to deal with the climate process, because it's only their human stories that will enable us as a church to empathise, to engage, and actually to transform the way we do church. So it's it's a reverse mission movement where we go to listen, we go to gather the information, and then we create the platform for these voices to be heard. So that's my solution. That's my challenge.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Matt, you've sort of given us a little bit of a solution already, or some ideas as to how we can begin to take forward. I just wondered if I can see some stuff going up on the screen. Is there anyone who would like to read something out to us, please? Are there any questions?
There's a big long one there.
There's a big long one there.
So Graham.
Oh, you're wanting the floor? Anyone? There. So Graham,
read it himself.
Yes.
Stop being lazy, Graham.
He's just scrolled up. Come back down, Graham.
It wasn't a question, he says. Oh, well.
Oh, right, that's okay, Graham.
Okay. Can I actually have a word with Matt as well?
Yeah, sure.
Your third nice way of being Jewish sounds terribly like the sort of, liberal democracy. It doesn't. The danger when we try and replicate that at least in UK and possibly in US society, is that it's so easily hijacked, and that people who are more intimidating and maybe more skillful with the argument tend to win the day rather than those who need to. And the beautiful game. I think dear Donald Trump recently, the mythical good people on both sides sort of thing. It is vulnerable to the situations of emergency that we're in, and I don't know whether we've got time for that sort of process. Also, can I be alongside Chrissie with the relationship with Jesus? I have information coming into my inbox every day which gives me every rational reason for despair, but to me Jesus says, do not worry about tomorrow. Sometimes it is as basic as that.
Okay, thanks, David. Matt, I know you're going to respond to this.
Yeah, just on that point, I think that to me the question isn't about. I think there's a practical question here, which is if we don't have I think what we see in Western democracies at the moment, to me, is actually a failure of what I've called machloket, a failure of that kind of critical debate. So it's not that we've got it and it's being exploited. It's the culture of post-truth and fake news is the exact opposite of what we're talking about. And it seems to me that it's an absolutely fundamental foundation to be able to agree on basic standards of conversation and debate and disagreement, and to be able to hear all of the voices and to be able to really wrestle with them and think about them. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone's that doesn't mean that we agree with everyone. It doesn't mean that it's not that kind of BBC style two-siders, both sides of the climate crisis. That's not what we're talking about here. It's about understanding who's saying what are the different perspectives, evaluating them critically. I mean, Paulo Freire, who's the Brazilian educator that I've been, that I love to read. He said you shouldn't, he said we need to be critical and teach students to be critical and to think and to argue, but we shouldn't confuse that with being wishy-washy. It's the opposite. It has to be extremely rigorous. We have to teach them to ask the hard questions and to really evaluate what's true and what isn't. Now, they're all going to come to different conclusions. That's life. I suppose the last bit I would say about that is that I'm also concerned. So I think philosophically or ideologically, or what we want to call it, I think there's actual inherent value in that, reflects a commitment to human dignity and to truth and all kinds of positive values. But I think there's a practical concern as well, which is that if we abandon the pursuit of machloket, we're not going to win. The bad guys will win. And I think abandoning that commitment to critical thinking and pluralism, that's exactly when we see someone emerging like Donald Trump or Fox News or whatever the equivalents in this country might be. So I think actually digging in and insisting that we hear different voices and learn how to critically evaluate them, to me, actually, it's more urgent now than ever.
Because I suppose, I don't know whether anyone from the floor wants to come back at that, because I think the challenge for me to both Chrissie and yourself would be, we will definitely support the work in hearing the voices, and particularly the people who are being affected by, this climate crisis or emergency. But I wondered whether or not there is an issue of time. Because there's quite a lot of listening to do. There's quite a lot of forgiveness. There's quite a lot of repentance, and also there's also that sense of admitting and apologizing and all of that, and building up relationships. Because in essence, we can't just turn up and say to folks that we're here to listen, when in the past, we were the oppressors. So we would have to have a change of heart, perhaps even a change of behavior as to how we approach people. So the whole idea with the foot washing, and of course, with Lawrence behind me, takes me back to, again, our Good Samaritan, injured man lying on the floor, people walk past, and the person who stops, the Samaritan who stops, actually has physical contact, doesn't he? He doesn't just say, wow, you're really badly wounded. He physically took hold of him and bound him up and made sure he got the appropriate help. So, yes, sorry, Victoria, we're off on the Good Samaritan again.
Yeah, I think I've just got Freire is a hero, right? Obviously, and I really enjoyed your paper, but I just have the post-truth reality that we're in now, that we've got people running the country who are graduates from horrible places like Cambridge and Oxford with PPE degrees, the most educated elites, and they're creating a situation where our working classes are fundamentally hostile and suspicious of education, because it produces things like clickbait, and then there's this post-truth era, and we can't critically think, and it feels a lot of research and education is going into this kind of self-serving kind of spin. I think David was talking about this in his paper a little bit as well. We don't need another theology of the climate. We don't need another moment. How do we translate this education, like Freire was trying to do, with actually building up the masses when we're in this odd situation of education something to be suspicious of? Right.
Chrissie wants to respond to that.
I'll respond to your question, Zadie, and to your question. It's a matter of people don't believe because they can't put their finger in Jesus' side. We don't believe what's happening in terms of climate change because we can't put our finger in their wounds. If the URC was to, there's plenty of time, there's plenty of money. We can send teams out tomorrow to some of the most oppressed, polluted places in the world. We can listen to them. We can go in repentance and say, we are sorry. That's the first thing we do. We say, we are sorry. We are coming in an opposite spirit. We recognize we have destroyed your livelihoods, your land. We come to listen. We come to serve. We come to wash your feet. Would you help us? So we can make films, we can make documentaries, we can pay for them to come to the UK, and then the church, to start with, can put our finger in their wounds, and we can believe. The person, Anthony was saying that the person in church didn't believe the expert who was talking about their lived experience. We need to facilitate the opportunity where those who carry the image of God, who are carrying the wounds of Christ today, where we can, as a church, put our finger on their side and say, okay, I see you, I hear you, I believe you, and I will respond.
One second, we have.
Whether David's got his hand up as well, so.
Okay,
My question there was really to Matt and Matt's thing. No. I'd like Matt to answer if that's okay.
Yeah, before we go, yeah.
So I think it's a great question, actually. I think it's very challenging. It seems to me that I was thinking about the analogy of, how people in cars behave really badly because they can't see each other.
BMWs especially. Yeah.
And it seems to me that, they shout and they're violent and they put their fingers up. My wife came the other day saying that she'd just been totally abused by someone in a traffic jam. And I'm sure that, had they been walking the street, none of that would have happened. And it's because you can't look each other in the face. And there's a theological implication to that as well, in terms, but there's a moral human one as well. And it seems to me that actually all of that is an analogy for the media climate that we're in. And we can't see each other anymore. In social, we interact on social online. We don't interact face to face anymore. We can't see each other. And because we can't see each other, we can't deal with each other as human beings. And all of those pedagogical principles that I was talking about can't really be enacted because we're simply not seeing each other as human beings and not seeing each other as the image of God, if you like religious language. And I think that's the educational challenge, but also the political challenge, because if we can learn, if we can, I should say, by the way, there are urgent political matters which need political action, which don't, we can cut to the chase and get on with it. Like, none of this prevents anyone going out and demonstrating. You can do that as well. I'm not sure how effective that is, but we can definitely do that at the same, we can design effective political actions quickly at the same time. So I think there's room for both, but it seems to me that there's a fundamental challenge in our society because of the technological and media age we live in. We don't see each other as human beings anymore. We don't see each other, forget about as human beings. That leads us to be unable to learn, to be unable to grapple with facts, to be unable to come up with proper perspectives on the truth and proper policy prescriptions. It ends up with populist, what's populism if not coming up with nonsense solutions to real problems, right? There's a real problem, but I'm putting my cards on the table. Brexit was not a solution to any. There were real problems. Brexit was not a solution to any of them. Right? I think we didn't know that at the time. We can see it now. But that's what happens, and that's what's going to happen again and again and again and again until we can get out of our cars, look each other in the face, grapple with the truth properly together, and understand the connection between the problem and the solution. Your proposal, by the way, of going out and listening to people, that strikes me as like the most natural thing in the world to do. Connect with people, look them in the face, understand what they're saying to you, wrestle with that. I don't want to call it data, it's not data, wrestle with that experience, right? Come up with working with them, come up with what do we think we should do about that now, be able to evaluate all of that. I was thinking in terms of climate crisis, I was thinking about what if there was a UK Citizens Assembly on the climate, right? Would that come up with better solutions or worse solutions than what we can do without that kind of deliberation? So, and we've seen examples of it, right, David? We've seen examples of that.
Yeah. Victor, does that address your?
I think I addressed what you said.
So there are several hands up. There's David, and there was Lawrence as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, but
sorry.
I'm fine. Go. We're at time.
I think we can go for another 5 minutes. So if we can get the questions through quite quickly, that would be great.
You can ask your questions, honestly. Yeah.
I was really going to be more affirming than asking a question, I think.
Okay.
I think this idea of listening to voices, I don't mean it in any kind of derogatory sense, but it feels so obvious, doesn't it? It's like listening to people with lived experiences. The URC has been on the journey the last 2 or 3 years, and nobody's going to pretend that it's been 100% successful at all, but a movement to become an anti-racist church. And there was a huge consultation, and there was a lot of resistance from some local churches, and we're not racist, or why should we be racist? All sorts of strange voices coming out. But the kind of the conversation shifted when, in recognition that if people actually heard the voices of Black people within the URC and what it's been like for them for the last 30, 40, 50 years, then that would help. And I think there's definitely been a shift since there were a series of films made. There's been all sorts of things that have happened. And when the churches have, when the congregations have engaged with that, they go, oh, right, didn't realise. So to me, it's so obvious that we need to hear about people's actual experiences and what's actually going on for people. I know that, you know, there's that horrible sort of paradox of the reason I feel it so strongly is because I've flown in an aeroplane across the world, which feels wrong, but seeing the climate crisis and the impact on people and hearing the stories of people that hits you in a way that somebody telling about it doesn't. But having shared personal stories, I know that my personal stories have impacted people who haven't seen it for themselves, but they've heard the stories. So I'm rambling a bit, but I'm just totally with you on the story thing and the foot washing as well. I don't know if a lot of you will be aware of John Vincent, who's a liberation theologian and set up the
urban theology
in Sheffield.
Yeah.
I think he's in his 90s now. He's an extraordinary man. But he's written all sorts of books, and proposes various models of mission, but they almost all start with the equivalent of foot washing, if not literally foot washing, but eating with people, sitting and listening, hearing people's stories, and the telling them about Jesus is quite a long way down the end of all of these models. It's about getting into relationship and being with people. And I think you're absolutely right, we've got that wrong so often, and we've got it the other way around. And it's only by hearing one another and listening. I'm going to make one very flippant point. Metal, yeah. I love the idea. I just wonder whether or not we think there's any parallel between that and consensus that we use.
Which has been and can be misused and hijacked, as we've seen.
Yes.
I think in theory it sounds very similar.
It does.
I'm not sure if it works in practice, but in theory we will hear everyone's voices.
Yes.
But are you content with the majority is how we end up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you put your flag down? Sorry,
David.
Okay. We are at a stage where it is beyond reasonable doubt that human activity is causing the disasters which are happening. And therefore, again, what I'd suggest for the church is, if I take Matt's cue of not being wishy-washy, is that regard climate denial absolutely in the same way you do racism. That first of all, it's stupid. Secondly, it harms other people first of all, and then gets round to harming you. And thirdly, it is deeply ingrained in our culture. So it needs naming, and the church should not give any space to it. And that would be a loving approach.
Thank you.
Just on the affirmation, I need to qualify because I realise I live with trauma. I suffer from PTSD severely. When I said what I've said, I am in a situation where the church we were married in 30 years ago, I've been in for 20 years, won't even talk to me. Won't even listen to me. My experience of moving into the United Reformed Church has been one feeling, because there is something very distinct about the URC, the way that you do things, the consensus that you have for your servants' work. So I may have projected onto you my angst about my rage. So please forgive me if I have.
Thank you.
Can I just one little thing? What you just said now, David. I agree with all of that. In other words, it's clear to me that racism is wrong, and that there's a climate crisis. That's all true. The challenge I think we face is how do we convince other people of that? Because those of us who already think that's fine. But those people need to be engaged and do something about it. But there are lots of people out there who either don't care or don't know or don't agree with that. And the question is, how do we convince them to get them on board? So the fact that it's true is kind of irrelevant. The question is, what kind of pedagogical process do you need to go through to get people to recognise it? Now, to recognise that it's true. Now, in the case of human-made,
you can't make them.
Well, so my question is, what kind of educational process can you take people through to get them to think through these issues and to stand as good a chance as possible of getting to empirically or rationally justified conclusions. In the case of racism or climate crisis, we probably know what those conclusions are going to be if we get the process right. There will be other social justice issues, by the way, but we don't know what the answer is exactly. You know, if you think about, I don't know, poverty or economic equality or benefits or how we arrange the economy, probably there's going to be a wider range of views as to what we should be doing and how we should structure society, right? I don't think we're all going to agree on those things. But I think the process should be the same. When we apply that process with young people or students in relation to racism or climate, I would hope that the majority of them, if they think through and engage with the process, would come to similar conclusions with each other. But by prejudging that, I think we prevent them from getting there, actually. So that's the...
But we're not in charge, so we can only be in control of ourselves, if anything at all. You can only represent a position. You cannot get people there. You cannot make them. We're not in charge.
Okay, we've got Lawrence absolutely desperate to make a point. Lawrence?
No, I mean, if there's not time...
No, there is time, Lawrence. We've just agreed there is time.
Great, thank you. So the question...
You can ask me about whether there's time for a little while.
I'm bringing this to the three of you. Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you. Really stimulating. And it's a South African perspective. You see, when I heard David talk about we want more church, I thought he meant we want more church and less religion. That what we wanted to be able to differentiate between is kind of institutional religion and faith, the practice of faith in the manner that Chrissie was talking about. And in the South African context of apartheid, they called it the moment of truth, because what they said, it is really important not just to take everything that is said by Christians as face value Christian stuff. So what we needed was the prophetic distinction between the cult, as it were, the cultists, and what was simply baptizing bad stuff in the name of God, in much the way that I was given Jonathan Sachs' book on Not My Name in Violence, something about God's name. I should know because I reviewed it. It's brilliant about, it doesn't matter who's saying it and how often you invoke God if it's not true. And so this is the South African voice would say, just as we in South Africa, the crisis of apartheid was so acute and so far-reaching that it actually became the means of distinguishing between what was true of God and what was not. And we need actually to be bringing that kind of criterion and distinction to this debate. And I wondered what the three of you would say about that, because it kind of flies across the lots of voices, potentially, or might look like it do.
Well, I have a sort of tangential response. I'm not sure it's a direct response, if that's... but I was thinking about two things. One was Abraham Joshua Heschel, the rabbi who marched with Martin Luther King, for example, and he described, I was reading something he wrote about racism as blasphemy. And he was like, he excoriated it. I mean, he was, it's the most powerful thing you can read when he writes about racism. And at the same, so that's one example. He was really clear. But Heschel would have been the first to realise that Jewish tradition is with racism. I mean, you can't get, if you read traditional texts, Christian texts as well, there's loads of racism in there. So how can you say that racism is blasphemy when it's right there in the Torah from the outset? So that's one thing. The second little example, which maybe speaks to that, I've got a colleague who's a rabbi in Manchester, who I actually interviewed when I was doing my research, and she talks about, she's got this faith that the Torah is pro-human rights, right? It's a document of human rights. And I asked her, how does she know? Like, how can she get that out of it? Because obviously there's loads of stuff in the Torah promoting genocide, for example. Like that's not very human rightsy. And it seems to me that she's got this technique of kind of like sort of rubbing sort of the text, kind of toying with it and rubbing it and putting different bits of the text together and interpreting it until an answer that felt right comes out. On the one hand, it might be that she's reading her own values in, right? And she's saying, if it supports my values, then I think it's true. Then I think it's really in there. But I think there was actually something more subtle going on, which was there was some sort of like interpretive hermeneutical process which does get to the something which is in the core of the text, which might not be on the surface. And I think, like, giving ourselves the time to scrape at the text until we can sort of figure out what's actually in there, you know, what's true or what's authentic, as opposed to just what it says on the surface, I think is really important as well. Always bearing in mind, of course, that we'll have political opponents or religious opponents that are doing the same thing, and probably getting to answers that we don't like as well. And we need to grapple with that too.
Okay, can I give the last word to David? Because I do have a little bit of historical history for him, so he can work out where his statement, "nothing about us without us," comes from. David.
Okay, probably in broad agreement really with Matt, and possibly even with Lawrence. What I'm not going to say is that theologians of other times and places were wrong, simply that what's happened is that what's dominant has begun to look definitive, so we're not able anymore to discern what different approaches are available. So in my work, I try to find, with integrity, what works for an environmental approach, while saying maybe people in other places who don't see that at all might also be right, but this is what we need to do.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I just say a very big thank you? Can we have a round of applause for our and just so for David, if he wishes to amend his paper, back in the 1990s.
Work in progress as ever, yeah.
Yeah. When community care came about in the late 90s, and people with learning disabilities were moved out of hospitals into various community settings, etc., there was a recognition that they were people and not just people who were locked away in institutions and didn't have anything to contribute to their society. And they developed partnership boards, various advocacy services where their voices could be heard. And they wrote a document that was entitled "Nothing About Us Without Us." Because for many years, as qualified staff, we have been making decisions on their behalf. Yet none of us were locked in that institution and had our rights taken away from us. So once we gave them that opportunity, we had to hear their voices and what they had to say. And it was just amazing. So it's a great start, and listening really does work. Thank you. So on behalf, thank you very much for being a great audience online and in person. Give yourself applause, both ends.